Banned places usually mean a fence and a warning sign. These 10 mean something stranger. Spots where the law itself says the government has to stay outside, sometimes on its own soil, sometimes by its own signature, and occasionally because nobody ever bothered to actually claim the place at all. So here are 10 banned places on Earth even the government can't enter. Number 10. Native American Sovereign Tribal Lands, United States. Federally recognized Native American tribes in the United States are legally considered domestic dependent nations, a status the Supreme Court first defined in the 1831 case Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, and it comes with a genuinely unusual consequence. State and local police often cannot simply walk onto reservation land and start enforcing state law the way they would anywhere else in the country. That legal framework got even more explicit a year later in Worcester versus Georgia, when Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that Georgia's state laws had no legal force within Cherokee territory at all, establishing a precedent that still shapes tribal jurisdiction today. In practice, this means many reservations operate under their own tribal police, tribal courts, and tribal law, with state officers generally needing specific federal authorization, a formal agreement, or a tribe's own consent before they can investigate crimes or make arrests on sovereign land. The system isn't absolute, and federal law enforcement retains authority over serious crimes under statutes like the Major Crimes Act of 1885, but for a huge range of everyday matters, tribal sovereignty means state governments genuinely have no legal right to enter and enforce their own laws. A legal reality that surprises most Americans who assume the government's reach never actually stops at a state line. The complexity only deepens, depending on which state a reservation sits in. A 1953 federal law called Public Law 280 transferred certain criminal and civil jurisdiction to a handful of states, including California and Minnesota, without requiring tribal consent, a decision many tribal nations have spent decades contesting as an overreach of the sovereignty they were originally promised. In states that never adopted Public Law 280, the jurisdictional lines remain sharper, and disputes over exactly which government, tribal, state, or federal, has authority to investigate a given incident on reservation land can still end up dragging through federal courts for years before anyone's allowed to act. A landmark 2020 Supreme Court decision, McGirt versus Oklahoma, underscored just how seriously courts still take these boundaries today, ruling that a huge swath of eastern Oklahoma, including most of the city of Tulsa, legally remains Muscogee Creek Nation reservation land for the purposes of federal criminal law, since Congress never formally disestablished it. The ruling effectively meant that certain crimes committed by or against Native Americans within that territory had been prosecuted in the wrong court system for decades, forcing Oklahoma to renegotiate jurisdictional agreements with multiple tribal nations almost overnight. A modern reminder that questions over exactly where a state's authority legally stops can still upend an entire justice system with a single ruling. Number 9. Bir Tawil, Egypt and Sudan. Wedged between Egypt and Sudan sits Bir Tawil, roughly 2,060 square kilometers of desert that holds a genuinely rare distinction. It belongs to no country on Earth. The situation traces back to two conflicting colonial-era borders drawn by the British, one in 1899 and another in 1902, that accidentally created two disputed territories instead of one, Bir Tawil and the more valuable, coastal Halaib Triangle. Here's the strange part. Egypt recognizes the 1899 border, which gives it Halaib but leaves Bir Tawil to Sudan. Sudan recognizes the 1902 border, which gives it Bir Tawil but leaves Halaib to Egypt. Because both countries want the resource-rich coastal territory far more than the empty desert strip, neither government has ever formally claimed Bir Tawil, since doing so would legally weaken their own claim to the land they actually want. The result is what international law calls terra nullius, land belonging to no one, and it's made Bir Tawil something of a magnet for eccentric self-declared monarchs over the years, including an American man who planted a flag there in 2014 so his daughter could technically call herself a princess. Nomadic Ababda tribespeople still move through the area seasonally, and neither Cairo nor Khartoum has ever bothered sending officials to stop them, mostly because, legally speaking, there's nothing there for either government to enforce. That American, a Virginia man named Jeremiah Heaton, made international headlines when he named his invented territory the Kingdom of North Sudan. But neither Egypt nor Sudan ever formally responded to the claim, largely because acknowledging it at all would have forced both governments back into the exact border dispute they've spent over a century avoiding. Small-scale gold mining does happen in the area, mostly by prospectors crossing in from Sudan, and while some of that activity has reportedly involved mercury contamination and occasional violent disputes over claims, no government maintains any regular presence there to police it, leaving Bir Tawil as one of the only pieces of habitable land on the planet where the closest thing to law enforcement is simply whoever happens to arrive first. Number 8. The high seas. Roughly 2/3 of the entire ocean falls outside the territorial waters of any nation, a zone international law calls the high seas, and no single government has jurisdiction to freely enter, search, or police vessels there without following a specific legal process. Under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, ships on the high seas fall under the authority of whatever country's flag they're flying, meaning a foreign navy generally can't just board a vessel there without permission, a declared emergency, or evidence of piracy, slavery, or unauthorized broadcasting. That legal gap has made the high seas a genuine haven for activity governments would otherwise shut down instantly closer to shore, from unlicensed pirate radio stations broadcasting in the mid-20th century to modern disputes over illegal fishing fleets that simply relocate outside anyone's territorial reach the moment inspectors show up. Enforcement typically only happens through international cooperation, treaties, and flag state consent, a patchwork system that leaves enormous stretches of open water functionally outside any single government's ability to walk in and take control. It's a strange legal quirk of the modern world. Astronauts have more territorial ambiguity to deal with these days than most sailors, since at least 2/3 of Earth's surface has never really belonged to anybody, and the law has simply had to build an entire enforcement system around that fact rather than pretending otherwise. The high seas have hosted their fair share of genuinely creative attempts to exploit that legal gray zone over the decades. In the 1960s, British pirate radio stations broadcast pop music from ships anchored just outside UK territorial waters, specifically to avoid the country's strict broadcasting laws, forcing Parliament to eventually pass the Marine Broadcasting Offences Act in 1967, just to close the loophole. More recently, so-called seasteading advocates have proposed building entirely new floating communities on the high seas, specifically to escape existing national laws and taxation. Projects that have so far mostly remained theoretical, largely because maintaining a permanent structure that far from shore and that far from any government willing to help if something goes wrong turns out to be considerably harder in practice than it looks in a pitch deck. Even piracy itself carries a unique legal status out there, since it's one of the only crimes recognized under what's called universal jurisdiction, meaning literally, any nation's navy is legally permitted to intervene against pirates on the high seas, regardless of whose flag the pirate ship or the victim's ship happens to fly. That exception exists precisely because piracy predates the modern nation-state system by centuries, and international law never fully caught up with a clean way to prosecute a crime committed by people who, by definition, don't answer to any single government's authority in the first place. It's a rare instance where the total absence of territorial ownership actually makes enforcement easier rather than harder, since everyone technically has the right to act, even if in practice, most countries would rather someone else's navy handle the paperwork. Number 7. The Principality of Sealand. Roughly 7 miles off the coast of Suffolk, England, sits Ruff's Tower, a decommissioned World War II anti-aircraft platform built in 1942 to shoot down German bombers. In 1967, a retired British Army major named Paddy Roy Bates seized the abandoned fort, originally intending to launch a pirate radio station, and instead declared it an independent nation, the Principality of Sealand, complete with its own flag, currency, and passports. The claim isn't just theater. A 1968 British court ruling determined that Ruff's Tower sat in international waters at the time, placing it outside UK jurisdiction, and Bates leaned on that ruling for decades afterward. In 1978, while Bates was traveling, a group of German and Dutch mercenaries actually stormed the platform and briefly held his son hostage in an attempted coup, only for Bates to retake the fort by helicopter and hold the invaders as prisoners of war, at one point causing a minor diplomatic incident when Germany sent an actual diplomat to negotiate their release. No United Nations member state formally recognizes Sealand's sovereignty, and Britain extended its territorial waters in 1987 to technically envelop the platform. Even so, the UK has never seriously attempted to reclaim it, leaving Sealand as arguably the world's most famous unrecognized micronation, a rusting sea fort that's been successfully calling itself its own country for well over half a century. The 1978 coup attempt remains the story most people bring up first, and for good reason. A group led by a German businessman named Alexander Achenbach, who'd previously served as Sealand's own prime minister before a falling out with the Bates family, landed by helicopter, took Bates's son Michael prisoner, and briefly declared themselves the new government. Roy Bates responded by staging his own helicopter assault, retaking the platform, and holding several of the invaders, including a German national, as prisoners of war for weeks, an incident serious enough that the German government eventually sent a diplomat to Sealand directly to negotiate their release, an act some Sealand supporters have since pointed to as the closest thing the platform ever got to formal international recognition. In the early 2000s, Sealand also briefly hosted an internet data hosting company called Haven Co., which advertised itself as beyond the reach of any nation's data laws, though the venture eventually wound down after disputes between its founders and the Bates family over how it should actually be run. Another reminder that a legal gray area is still, ultimately, easier to claim than it is to keep profitably running. Number 6. Kowloon Walled City, Hong Kong. Kowloon Walled City began as a small Chinese military outpost, but an unresolved diplomatic dispute following Britain's 1898 lease of Hong Kong's new territories left the tiny enclave in genuine legal limbo. China never fully relinquished its claim, Britain never fully enforced its authority, and for the better part of a century, neither government actually governed the place at all. That power vacuum turned catastrophic after World War II, as refugees fleeing China's civil war poured into the walled city, discovering a patch of land where neither colonial police nor Chinese officials would evict them. By the 1980s, roughly 33,000 people were packed into just 2.7 hectares, making it one of the most densely populated pieces of land in human history. A chaotic maze of unlicensed dentists, opium dens, and triad-run gambling parlors that police mostly avoided entering, except in rare, large-scale coordinated raids. The legal ambiguity finally ended once Britain and China negotiated Hong Kong's eventual handover, agreeing to demolish the entire complex starting in 1993. Residents were relocated, the walled city was torn down, and the site is now a quiet public park, the only physical evidence left of a place that spent nearly 100 years belonging to two governments that both refused to actually run it. Despite its lawless reputation, the walled city wasn't purely chaos. A local Kaifeng welfare association effectively filled the governance vacuum, organizing basic sanitation, mediating disputes, and coordinating with British Hong Kong officials on practical matters, even though no formal government authority technically existed. Structural engineers who later studied the site marveled at how the community managed to build interconnected towers up to 14 stories tall, entirely without licensed architects, building codes, or safety inspections, relying instead on informal knowledge passed between residents about which additions a given foundation could actually support. By the time demolition began, journalists and researchers who documented the walled city extensively noted that daily life inside had become far more mundane than its fearsome reputation suggested, with families running small factories, unlicensed dental clinics, and noodle shops in the same corridors where triad gambling dens operated just a few floors away. British lawmakers themselves openly acknowledged the strangeness of the situation while it was still unfolding. During a 1974 House of Lords debate, one member described the enclave bluntly, noting that speculators had realized here was a place where there was no law, neither British colonial law nor Chinese law. A combination of lawlessness and soaring land values he argued existed nowhere else on the planet. That same legal vacuum, left unresolved for the better part of a century by two governments each unwilling to either fully claim or fully abandon the site, ultimately shaped the walled city's entire identity far more than any single ruler, gang, or government ever did. Number 5. The International Space Station. Roughly 250 miles above Earth, the International Space Station operates under one of the strangest jurisdictional arrangements ever created. The 1998 Intergovernmental Agreement, signed by the United States, Russia, and the station's other partner nations, established that each country retains legal jurisdiction only over its own registered modules and its own astronauts, meaning no single government actually controls the station as a whole. That arrangement occasionally produces genuinely bizarre legal situations. In 2019, NASA investigated allegations that astronaut Anne McClain had accessed her estranged spouse's bank account from orbit, a case that required figuring out, for what was reportedly the first time, exactly which country's laws even applied to an alleged crime committed inside a Russian-registered module by an American citizen. The case was eventually dropped, but it highlighted just how untested the station's legal framework really is. Because authority is split module by module and astronaut by astronaut, no government, not even the countries that helped fund and build the station, can simply claim full jurisdiction over the entire structure. It remains one of the only functioning pieces of infrastructure in existence, built entirely on the premise that everyone involved shares partial ownership and nobody gets to be fully in charge. The 1998 agreement actually built on an older framework, the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, which established that no nation can claim sovereignty over any part of outer space itself, a principle that made an arrangement like the ISS's patchwork jurisdiction almost inevitable once multiple countries decided to build something together up there. In practice, this means an American astronaut working inside the Russian-built Zvezda module technically falls under different legal jurisdiction than the moment they float back into the American-built Destiny lab a few meters away, a level of legal precision that sounds almost absurd until you remember that everyone involved is orbiting the planet at roughly 17,500 miles an hour, making the usual rules about borders and boundaries considerably harder to apply in any conventional sense. Number 4. Antarctica. Antarctica is the only continent on Earth with no native government, no permanent population, and, under international law, no recognized national sovereignty at all. 7 countries, including the UK, Argentina, Chile, and Australia, have made overlapping territorial claims over the decades, some of which physically overlap each other entirely. But the 1959 Antarctic Treaty froze all of those claims indefinitely, meaning none of them are legally recognized or enforceable in any practical sense. The treaty, now signed by more than 50 nations, explicitly bans military activity, weapons testing, and nuclear waste disposal anywhere on the continent, reserving it instead for peaceful scientific research. Any signatory nation is entitled to inspect any other country's research station at any time without needing permission, a level of mutual, built-in transparency that essentially no other place on the planet operates under. The result is a continent that technically belongs to everyone and no one simultaneously, governed by consensus among treaty members rather than by any single government's police or military. Around 40 research stations from nearly 30 countries currently operate there, coexisting under an agreement that's held remarkably steady for over 65 years, proof that even the coldest, most remote place on Earth can run smoother than plenty of actual countries. That unrestricted inspection right has actually been exercised more than once, giving Antarctica a strange kind of transparency most nations would never tolerate on their own soil. Under the treaty, Any signatory can show up unannounced at another country's research base and verify that no prohibited military activity is taking place. A provision written specifically because Cold War negotiators worried the continent's remoteness might otherwise make it an ideal spot to quietly test weapons far from prying eyes. A separate 1991 environmental protocol went even further, banning all mineral and oil extraction on the continent for at least 50 years, a restriction set to come up for review starting in 2048, meaning the question of who actually gets to profit from Antarctica's resources, if anyone ever does, remains one of the more consequential items still sitting on the world's long-term diplomatic to-do list. Even national territorial claims that predate the treaty, like Britain's, Chile's, and Argentina's overlapping slices of the Antarctic Peninsula, remain technically on the books but functionally frozen, meaning 3 different governments can each print a map showing the same stretch of ice as their own without any of them actually being able to do a single thing about it. Number 3. United Nations Headquarters, New York. Tucked along the East River in Manhattan sits 18 acres of land that, legally speaking, isn't part of the United States at all. Under a 1947 agreement between the U.S. government and the newly formed United Nations, the headquarters site was granted extraterritorial status, meaning it operates as genuine international territory, owned collectively by all member states rather than by the country that happens to surround it. The practical result is spelled out explicitly in the UN's own official documentation. No federal, state, or local officer or official of the United States, whether administrative, judicial, military, or police, may enter UN headquarters, except with the consent of and under conditions agreed to by the Secretary General of the organization. That's not just a courtesy. It's binding international law, meaning the NYPD genuinely cannot walk through those gates and start investigating a crime without the UN's own explicit permission first. That protection isn't absolute immunity for wrongdoing, since the UN maintains its own agreement with the US preventing the headquarters from being used as a hideout for fugitives, and in 2005, Secretary General Kofi Annan formally waived diplomatic immunity for several officials implicated in the oil for food scandal, allowing American courts to prosecute them. But under ordinary circumstances, a stretch of land surrounded on every side by one of the most heavily policed cities on Earth remains, technically, somewhere the NYPD has absolutely no automatic right to set foot. The territory itself came together through an unlikely piece of philanthropy. After more than 200 cities and towns across the country lobbied to host the fledgling organization following World War II, John D. Rockefeller Jr. personally donated $8.5 million specifically to purchase an 18-acre stretch of Manhattan slaughterhouses and light industrial buildings along the East River, land the city of New York, then supplemented with additional rights and infrastructure to seal the deal. Construction ran from 1948 to roughly 1952, and today, the site operates with its own security force, fire department, and postal service issuing UN-specific stamps that aren't valid anywhere else on the planet, giving the organization a genuinely self-contained little country tucked quietly between First Avenue and the river. Number 2. Foreign embassies and diplomatic missions. Under the 1961 Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, embassy grounds around the world are considered legally inviolable, meaning the host country's police, no matter how serious the suspected crime taking place inside, cannot enter without the explicit permission of the ambassador in charge. It's the same legal principle that let WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange live inside Ecuador's embassy in London for nearly 7 years, from 2012 to 2019, entirely beyond the reach of British police waiting right outside the front door. That protection has occasionally produced genuinely tragic results. In 1984, during an anti-Gaddafi protest outside Libya's embassy in London, someone inside the building opened fire into the crowd and killed a young British police officer named Yvonne Fletcher. Because the embassy remained legally inviolable, British police had no legal authority to enter and arrest the shooter, and diplomatic relations with Libya were simply severed instead, an outcome that led Parliament to eventually pass the Diplomatic and Consular Premises Act of 1987, giving Britain limited power to revoke a building's diplomatic status under extreme circumstances. Under normal conditions, though, the rule holds firm worldwide, precisely because every country benefits from the same protection for its own embassies abroad. It's a rare case where a government's inability to enter a building on its own soil isn't a loophole so much as the entire point. A mutual promise that keeps diplomats everywhere from being pulled out of their own missions by force. The concept of protected diplomatic space predates the 1961 convention by centuries, tracing back to ancient customs where messengers between rival kingdoms were considered untouchable, specifically so hostile nations could still negotiate without fear of losing their envoys to violence or arrest. That same logic played out dramatically during the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, when foreign embassies across Madrid sheltered thousands of people fleeing political violence, and again in 1973, when supporters of Chile's overthrown government sought refuge inside the embassies of Mexico, Panama, and Venezuela after a military coup, all of whom were eventually allowed safe passage out of the country specifically because of the same inviolability principle that later kept Assange inside Ecuador's embassy for nearly 7 years. Assange finally left in April 2019, not because the legal protection ever weakened, but because Ecuador's government itself withdrew his asylum and invited British police inside. A reminder that the rule protects the building at the ambassador's discretion, not indefinitely by default, and that even the strongest legal shield in international law still ultimately answers to whoever's flag happens to be flying over the front door. Number 1. Vatican City. No list like this one could end anywhere else. Vatican City sits entirely inside the city of Rome, and yet, since February 11, 1929, it has existed as a fully independent sovereign state, separate from Italy in every legal sense that matters. The Lateran Treaty, signed that year between the Holy See and Mussolini's government, states the arrangement in language about as blunt as international law ever gets. Italy's sovereignty and exclusive jurisdiction over Vatican City forbid any intervention therein on the part of the Italian government. In practice, that means Italian police, prosecutors, and government officials have zero legal authority to cross into Vatican territory, even though it sits smack in the middle of their own capital city. The Vatican maintains its own security force, the Pontifical Swiss Guard, alongside a separate gendarmerie corps that handles day-to-day policing, and any request from Italian authorities for cooperation has to go through official diplomatic channels rather than a simple phone call between neighboring departments. At just 0.44 square kilometers, Vatican City is the smallest sovereign state on the planet, and yet it operates with the exact same territorial independence as any country 1,000 times its size. It remains, more than 9 decades after that treaty was signed, the single clearest example on Earth of a government legally, permanently, and deliberately locked out of a patch of land, sitting entirely within its own borders, right in the middle of the very city it governs everything else around. The independence granted in 1929 resolved what historians call the Roman Question, a decades-long standoff that began in 1870 when Italian troops seized the last of the Pope's territorial holdings during Italy's unification. For nearly 60 years afterward, successive popes refused to leave Vatican grounds at all, effectively declaring themselves prisoners inside the walls in protest of Italy's annexation, a standoff that only ended once Mussolini's government, eager for the Catholic Church's political support, agreed to grant the Vatican its own sovereign territory in exchange for recognizing the Kingdom of Italy. Beyond the walls of Vatican City itself, the Lateran Treaty also granted extraterritorial status to a handful of additional properties scattered throughout Rome, including major basilicas, and the Pope's summer residence at Castel Gandolfo, meaning Italy's largest city, is dotted with small legal islands where Italian authority simply doesn't apply, a patchwork arrangement that's occasionally caused genuine confusion over property lines. Most notably, a disputed 3-meter strip along the edge of St. Peter's Square that Italy and the Vatican still don't fully agree on today. 10 places protected by treaties, court rulings, and international law rather than fences or armed guards, and every single one of them proves the same point. Sometimes the strongest lock on a door isn't steel, it's a signature on a piece of paper. From a sea fort claiming its own royal family to an entire country hidden inside a single city block, the world has more legal blind spots than most people ever realize exist. If you enjoyed this one, hit like, subscribe for more of these, and let me know in the comments which of these surprised you the most. See you in the next video.